The dust kicked up around Julia Owens's worn boots as she stood outside the general store in Great Bend, Kansas, her fingers trembling as she twisted the thin gold band on her left hand. It was August of 1878, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town, but the heat was nothing compared to the gnawing emptiness in her stomach that had been her constant companion for 3 days now. She had arrived in Great Bend 2 weeks ago with her husband Thomas, full of hope and dreams of starting fresh after losing their farm back in Missouri to the bank. Thomas had promised her they would find work here, that the growing cattle trade would provide opportunities. Instead, he had found a poker game in the saloon and lost every cent they had to their name. When she confronted him about it, he had struck her across the face, taken her horse, and ridden out of town before dawn, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the wedding ring that had once symbolized a future that now felt like a cruel joke. Julia stared through the window of the general store at the loaves of bread stacked neatly on the counter. Her mouth watered at the sight. The store owner, Mr. Henderson, was a hard man who had already turned her away twice when she tried to ask for work. There were no jobs for women in this town, at least none that she could find. She had knocked on every door, offered to clean, cook, mend clothes, anything. But Great Bend was small, and the women here took care of their own households. The men just looked at her with suspicion or something worse in their eyes that made her skin crawl. She looked down at her wedding ring again. It was a simple band, nothing fancy, but it was real gold. Her mother had given it to her on her wedding day 3 years ago, sliding it onto her finger with tears in her eyes. Julia could still hear her mother's voice, soft and hopeful, telling her that marriage was a sacred bond. Her mother had been dead wrong about that, at least when it came to Thomas Owens. Taking a deep breath, Julia pulled the ring off her finger. Her hand felt naked without it, but her stomach felt emptier still. She pushed open the door to the general store, the bell above jingling to announce her entrance. Mr. Henderson looked up from behind the counter, his expression immediately souring when he saw her. "I told you, I do not have any work for you." "I am not here for work," Julia said, her voice steadier than she felt. She walked to the counter and placed the ring on the worn wood surface. "I want to trade this for food." The store owner picked up the ring, examining it with a critical eye. He held it up to the light streaming through the window, then bit it gently to test the metal. Julia felt a flush of shame creep up her neck as she watched him assess the only valuable thing she owned. "It is real gold," she said quietly. "My mother gave it to me." "I can see that," Henderson replied, his tone neither kind nor cruel, just matter of fact. "I will give you a loaf of bread for it." "A loaf of bread?" Julia's voice rose despite her best efforts to remain calm. "This ring is worth at least $20. "Maybe in a big city," Henderson said, setting the ring back down on the counter. "But here, I have no use for a woman's wedding ring. Nobody is going to buy it from me. A loaf of bread is a fair trade. Take it or leave it." Julia felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She knew he was cheating her, but what choice did she have? She was so hungry she could barely think straight, and the weakness in her limbs was getting worse each day. "Fine," she whispered, reaching for the ring to push it closer to him. "That will not be necessary," a deep voice said from behind her. Julia spun around to find a tall cowboy standing just inside the doorway. She had not heard him enter, had not heard the bell ring. He was lean and weathered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of whiskey in firelight. He wore dusty trail clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across a face that was handsome in a rugged, lived-in way. A holster hung low on his hip, the leather worn smooth from use. "Excuse me," Henderson said, his tone turning sharp. The cowboy walked forward, his spurs jingling softly with each step. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, someone who had seen enough of life not to be rattled by much. When he reached the counter, he picked up Julia's ring and held it out to her. "This belongs to you," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Julia stared at him, confused. "I was trading it for food." "I heard," the cowboy said, "but you are not going to do that." He turned to Henderson. "Give the lady a loaf of bread and put it on my account." Henderson's expression shifted to something more calculating. "Your account is already running pretty high, Bennett." "Then add one more loaf to it," the man called Bennett said. "I will settle up at the end of the month like always." "I want cash for the bread," Henderson insisted. Bennett reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins, placing them on the counter with a decisive clink. "There. Now give the lady the bread." Henderson hesitated for a moment, then shrugged and turned to grab a loaf from the shelf behind him. He wrapped it in brown paper and handed it across the counter. Bennett took it and offered it to Julia. She stared at the bread, then at the ring still in the cowboy's other hand, then up at his face. "I do not understand. Why would you do this?" "Because nobody should have to trade their wedding ring for a single loaf of bread when it is worth so much more," Bennett said simply. "Take them both. They are yours." "But I cannot pay you back," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have nothing." "I am not asking you to pay me back," Bennett replied. He pressed the ring into her palm, his fingers warm and calloused against her skin. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through her, an awareness she had not felt in a very long time. "I am not asking for anything." Julia's throat tightened with emotion. She could not remember the last time someone had shown her kindness without expecting something in return. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Thank you so much," Bennett nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You are welcome, miss." He tipped his hat to her and turned to leave. "Wait," Julia called out. He paused, glancing back at her. "I am Julia Owens." "Bennett Cole," he said. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mrs. Owens." The title stung, a reminder of the marriage that had turned to ashes. "It is just Julia," she said quickly. "Please just call me Julia." Something flickered in Bennett's eyes, understanding perhaps, but he did not press her on it. "Just Julia, then. Take care of yourself." He left the store, and Julia stood there clutching the bread and her ring, feeling as though something had just shifted in her world. She looked down at the ring in her hand, then slipped it back onto her finger, but it felt different now. It no longer symbolized broken promises. Now it represented something else, something she could not quite name yet. "If you are done staring after cowboys, you should probably leave my store," Henderson said sourly. "Unless you plan on buying something else." Julia lifted her chin and walked out without responding. She was not going to let his bitterness touch the small miracle that had just occurred. Outside, she saw Bennett walking down the dusty street toward the livery stable. She watched him go, committing his figure to memory, the way he carried himself with quiet strength. She tore off a piece of bread and ate it slowly, savoring every bite. It was simple fare, just wheat bread with a slightly tough crust, but to her it tasted like the finest meal she had ever eaten. As she chewed, she thought about Bennett Cole and wondered what kind of man gave freely to a stranger without asking for anything in return. In her experience, such men did not exist. Everyone wanted something. Thomas had wanted a wife to cook and clean. The men in town who had offered her help had made it clear what they expected in exchange. But Bennett had asked for nothing, expected nothing. Julia finished half the loaf and carefully wrapped the rest back in the paper. She needed to make it last. As she walked down the street, She tried to formulate a plan. She could not stay in Great Bend indefinitely without money or means. The small boarding house where she had been staying had already told her she could not remain past the end of the week without paying. She had nowhere to go and no way to get there even if she did. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Julia found herself walking toward the livery stable without consciously deciding to do so. She told herself she just wanted to thank Bennett properly, but deep down she knew it was more than that. There was something about him that drew her, a sense of safety she had not felt in years. The livery was a large wooden structure at the edge of town, and as Julia approached, she could hear the sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the low murmur of male voices. She hesitated at the entrance, suddenly feeling foolish. What was she doing here? The man had done her a kindness. That did not mean he wanted her following him around. "Can I help you, miss?" A young man, barely out of his teens, appeared in the doorway. He had a friendly face and curious eyes. "I was looking for Bennett Cole," Julia said. "Is he here?" "Sure is," the young man said. "He is in the back checking on his horse. I will fetch him for you." "No, that is all right," Julia started to say, but the young man had already disappeared into the stable, calling out Bennett's name. A moment later, Bennett emerged from the shadows of the barn, leading a beautiful sorrel mare. When he saw Julia, surprise flashed across his face, followed by what might have been pleasure. "Julia," he said, "is everything all right? Did Henderson give you trouble?" "No, nothing like that," she assured him quickly. "I just wanted to thank you properly. What you did, it meant more to me than you could know." Bennett secured his horse to a post and walked over to her. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck where it brushed his collar. He was perhaps 30 years old, she guessed, with the bearing of someone who had lived a full life already. "It was just bread and a bit of truth-telling," Bennett said. "You do not need to thank me." "But I do," Julia insisted. "In this town, in my situation, kindness is rare. You did not have to help me, but you did. That matters." Bennett studied her for a long moment, and Julia felt exposed under his gaze, as though he could see all the struggles and heartaches she carried. "What is your situation, if you do not mind my asking? You said you are not married, but you wear a wedding ring, and you are clearly in need of help." Julia felt her cheeks flush with shame. She did not want to tell this man her story, did not want him to know how foolish she had been to trust Thomas, how naive to think love would be enough. But something in Bennett's eyes told her he would not judge her, that he had seen enough of life to understand its complications. "My husband left me," she said simply. "He gambled away everything we had and then rode out of town 2 weeks ago. I have been trying to find work, but there is nothing for me here. I was desperate enough to trade my ring because I had not eaten in 3 days. Bennett's jaw tightened. "What is your husband's name?" "Thomas Owens." "Why?" "Just curious," Bennett said, but something in his tone suggested it was more than curiosity. A man who would abandon his wife deserves to be known for the coward he is. "He is not worth knowing," Julia said bitterly. "I married him thinking he was a good man. I was wrong." "His failings are not yours," Bennett said gently. "You should not carry shame for his actions." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Julia felt tears threatening again and blinked them back. "I need to find work. I need to find a way to survive. Do you know of anything?" "Anyone who might need help?" Bennett was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "My ranch could use some help. My housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, has been wanting an extra set of hands. The work is hard, cooking and cleaning for the ranch hands, but it comes with room and board and fair wages." Julia's heart leaped. "Do you mean it? You would give me work. I would offer you the opportunity to work, Bennett corrected. Mrs. Patterson runs a tight ship. She will expect you to earn your keep. But if you are willing to work hard, then yes, there is a place for you at the Cole Ranch. I will work as hard as I need to, Julia said fervently. I promise you I will not disappoint you. I believe you, Bennett said, and the simple faith in those words made Julia's throat tight with emotion. Can you ride? Yes, Julia said, or I could before my husband took my horse. You can ride with me then, Bennett said. The ranch is about an hour outside of town. We should head out now if we want to make it before full dark. Julia nodded, barely able to believe her luck. An hour ago she had been preparing to trade her last possession for food, and now she had both her ring and the promise of work, all because of this stranger's kindness. Bennett saddled his horse, a process Julia watched with interest. He moved with practiced efficiency, checking the cinch and stirrups with care. When he was done, he led the mare over to where Julia stood. Her name is Rosie, Bennett said, patting the horse's neck affectionately. She is gentle as they come. You ready? Julia nodded. Bennett mounted first, then reached down to help Julia up. She took his hand, feeling the strength in his grip as he pulled her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's back, acutely aware of how close she was to Bennett, how she had to put her arms around his waist to keep from sliding off. Hold on tight, Bennett said, his voice rumbling through his chest where her cheek nearly pressed against his back. He urged Rosie forward, and they left Great Bend behind, heading out into the prairie as the sun continued its descent. The landscape around them was vast and open, covered in golden grasses that swayed in the evening breeze. The air smelled of earth and sage, and despite everything she had been through, Julia felt something close to peace settle over her. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clip of Rosie's hooves and the creak of leather. Julia found herself relaxing against Bennett's back, exhaustion from the past weeks catching up with her. She had been so tense for so long, always on guard, always worried about where her next meal would come from or where she would sleep. Now, for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Tell me about your ranch, Julia said eventually, wanting to break the comfortable silence. It is nothing fancy, Bennett said. About 2,000 acres along the Arkansas River. I run cattle mostly, some horses. I have 6 ranch hands who work full-time and a few more who come during roundup season. Mrs. Patterson has been keeping house for me since my mother passed 3 years ago, but she is getting older and the work is getting harder for her. I am sorry about your mother, Julia said softly. Thank you, Bennett replied. She was a good woman. Raised me and my brother on that ranch after my father died when I was 12. She worked herself to the bone to keep the ranch going, to make sure we had what we needed. I owe everything I have to her. You have a brother, had, Bennett said, and Julia heard the pain in that single word. He died 4 years ago. He was caught in a stampede during a cattle drive. Happened so fast there was nothing anyone could do. I am so sorry, Julia said, her heart aching for him. That must have been terrible. It was, Bennett admitted. He was my best friend. We built the ranch together, dreamed about what it could become. After he died, I thought about selling it, leaving. But this land, this ranch, it is his legacy as much as mine. I could not let it go. They rode on, and Julia felt a connection forming between them, something built on shared losses and understanding. She wanted to know more about this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness, wanted to understand what made him different from other men she had known. Why did you help me today? She asked. You do not know me. I could be anyone. Bennett was quiet for a long moment. I helped you because it was the right thing to do, he finally said. But if I am being honest, I also helped you because I know what it is like to be desperate, to feel like the world has turned its back on you. After my brother died, I was in a dark place. There was a man in town, old Samuel Mitchell, who gave me work when I needed it most, who did not ask questions or demand explanations. He just offered me a chance. He told me that kindness is never wasted, even when it seems like it is. I figure I am just passing that forward. This Samuel Mitchell sounds like a wise man, Julia said. He was, Bennett agreed. He passed last winter. I think about him often, about the grace he showed me when I needed it most. The sun had fully set by the time they crested a small rise, and Julia saw the ranch spread out below them. It was larger than she had expected, with a main house, a big barn, several outbuildings, and a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Lights glowed warmly in the windows of the main house, and Julia could see the silhouettes of cattle in the distance, dark shapes against the twilight. "Welcome to the Cole Ranch," Bennett said, and there was pride in his voice. They rode down to the main house, and Bennett dismounted first before helping Julia down. Her legs were shaky from the ride, and she stumbled slightly. Bennett's hand steadied her, his grip firm but gentle. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," Julia said. "Just tired. Let us get you inside and introduce you to Mrs. Patterson. She will fix you up with a proper meal and a place to sleep." The front door opened before they reached it, and an older woman stepped out onto the porch. She was plump and gray-haired, with a face that spoke of both sternness and kindness. She wore a simple dress and an apron, and her sharp eyes took in Julia with a single sweeping glance. "Bennett Cole, what have you brought home now?" she asked, but there was no real reproach in her tone. "This is Julia Owens," Bennett said. "Julia, this is Mrs. Patterson. She runs this house and keeps us all in line." "She looks half-starved," Mrs. Patterson said, coming down the porch steps. "Get her inside, Bennett. I will not have a young woman fainting on my doorstep." "Yes, madam," Bennett said with a slight smile. To Julia he added, "You are in good hands now." Mrs. Patterson ushered Julia into the house, and the warmth and light inside were almost overwhelming. The main room was large and comfortable, with worn furniture that invited you to sit, a stone fireplace, and shelves lined with books. It smelled of cooking and wood smoke and something else, something that reminded Julia of home back when home had been a good place. "Sit, Mrs. Patterson commanded, pointing to a chair at the large wooden dining table. "I will get you some supper." Julia sat, and Bennett took the chair across from her. Mrs. Patterson disappeared into what Julia assumed was the kitchen, and Bennett leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You will like it here," he said. "Mrs. Patterson is tough but fair. She will work you hard, but she will also make sure you are well taken care of." "I am grateful for the opportunity," Julia said. "Truly." Mrs. Patterson returned with a plate piled high with beef stew and biscuits, and a glass of milk. "Eat," she said, setting it in front of Julia. "You look like you have not had a decent meal in weeks." Julia did not need to be told twice. She dug into the food, trying to maintain some semblance of manners even though she wanted to devour everything on the plate. The stew was rich and flavorful, the biscuits light and buttery. It was the best thing she had tasted in months. "Slow down," Mrs. Patterson said, not unkindly. "You will make yourself sick if you eat too fast after going without." Julia forced herself to slow down, taking smaller bites. Mrs. Patterson sat down at the table with them, her eyes still assessing Julia. "Bennett tells me you need work," she said. "Yes, madam," Julia replied. "I am a hard worker. I can cook, clean, so tend a garden, whatever you need." "Can you handle cooking for 8 hungry men 3 times a day?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "I can," Julia said. "Can you do laundry for all of them, keep this house clean, and help me with the preserving and canning when the time comes?" "Yes, madam." Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. All right then. You will earn $10 a month plus room and board. You will have Sundays off except for preparing meals. You will sleep in the small room off the kitchen. Is that agreeable? $10 a month was more than Julia had hoped for. It is more than agreeable. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Do not thank me yet, the older woman said. Wait until you have worked a full day. Then we will see if you still want to thank me. But there was a twinkle in Mrs. Patterson's eye that told Julia the sternness was mostly for show. This woman had a kind heart underneath that gruff exterior. Bennett stood up from the table. I will let you two get acquainted. I need to check on the hands in the bunkhouse, make sure everything is settled for the night. Thank you again, Julia said, looking up at him. For everything. Bennett met her eyes and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Sleep well, Julia. Tomorrow is a new start. After he left, Mrs. Patterson showed Julia to her room. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. To Julia, who had been sleeping on a hard cot in a boarding house room that smelled of mildew and other people's despair, it looked like luxury. There is water in the pitcher, Mrs. Patterson said. Privy is out back. We rise at 4:30 to start breakfast. Can you manage that? Yes, madam, Julia said. Good. Mrs. Patterson started to leave, then turned back. I do not know what happened to you, and I am not asking, but you are safe here. Bennett Cole is a good man, and this is a good place. Work hard and be honest, and you will do fine. I will, Julia promised. After Mrs. Patterson left, Julia sat on the bed and finally let the tears come. They were not tears of sadness, though there was some of that mixed in. Mostly they were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. This morning, she had been prepared to trade away the last piece of her past for a loaf of bread. Tonight she had a job, a place to stay, and the kindness of strangers who had become something more in the span of a few hours. She pulled off her boots and lay back on the bed, not even bothering to undress. She was asleep almost as soon as her head hit the pillow, falling into the first truly restful sleep she had experienced in weeks. The next morning, Julia woke to the sound of someone knocking on her door. She sat up, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. Gray light filtered through the small window, suggesting dawn was just breaking. Julia, time to get up, Mrs. Patterson's voice called through the door. I am awake, Julia called back. She quickly used the water in the pitcher to wash her face and hands, then hurried out to the kitchen. Mrs. Patterson was already there, her sleeves rolled up and an apron tied around her waist. You know how to make biscuits? She asked without preamble. Yes, madam. Good. You make the biscuits. I will handle the eggs and bacon. Coffee is already brewing. The men will be in shortly and they will be hungry. Julia tied on an apron and got to work. Her hands remembered the motions of mixing flour and lard, rolling out dough, cutting rounds. It was comforting, this familiar work, and she found herself relaxing into it. The ranch hands started filing in just as the food was ready. They were a rough-looking bunch, weathered and worn from hard work, but their manners were surprisingly good. They greeted Mrs. Patterson respectfully and looked at Julia with open curiosity but no disrespect. Bennett came in last, and Julia felt her heart do a strange little flip when she saw him. He had cleaned up from the day before, his face freshly shaved, his hair damp from washing. He met her eyes across the room and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that made her feel seen in a way she had not felt in a long time. Morning, he said to the room at large. Morning, boss, the men chorused. They all sat down at the long table and Julia and Mrs. Patterson served the food. The men ate with single-minded focus, shoveling in eggs and bacon and biscuits like they had not eaten in days. Julia watched nervously, hoping her biscuits were good enough. One of the younger ranch hands, a sandy-haired man with a sunburned face, looked up at her and grinned. "Best biscuits we have had in a month, madam. No offense, Mrs. Patterson." "None taken," Mrs. Patterson said dryly. "I know my biscuits are merely adequate. It is nice to have someone around who can do better." Julia felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment. "Thank you." After breakfast, the men headed out to start their day's work. Bennett lingered, helping to clear the table despite Mrs. Patterson's protests that it was not his job. "How did you sleep?" he asked Julia. "Better than I have in a long time," she admitted. "Thank you again for this opportunity." "You are earning your keep," Bennett said. "Those biscuits were excellent." "He is right," Mrs. Patterson said. "You have a talent for baking that will be useful around here." The days settled into a rhythm. Julia woke before dawn to help Mrs. Patterson prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. After the men ate and headed out to work, she and Mrs. Patterson would clean the kitchen and start preparing the midday meal. Then there was laundry to do, floors to sweep, chickens to feed, and 100 other tasks that kept Julia busy from sunup until well after sundown. It was hard work, harder than anything Julia had done before, but it was honest work and she was good at it. More than that, she felt useful, valued. The ranch hands always thanked her for the meals, Mrs. Patterson praised her when she did something particularly well, and Bennett made a point of speaking with her each day, asking how she was settling in. She found herself looking forward to those conversations with Bennett. He would come in from working on the ranch, dusty and tired, and sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee while she kneaded bread or peeled potatoes. He would tell her about his day, about the cattle they were moving or the fence they were mending, and she would tell him about her work in the house. It was comfortable and easy, this growing friendship between them. A week passed, then two. Julia began to feel like she belonged at the Cole ranch. She learned the names of all the ranch hands. There was young Tommy, the sandy-haired one who always complimented the cooking. There was old Pete, who had worked for Bennett's father and was full of stories about the old days. There was Jack and Sam, brothers who could rope a calf faster than anyone Julia had ever seen. There was Henry, who played guitar in the evenings and had a surprisingly beautiful singing voice. And there was Carlos, who spoke with a soft Spanish accent and treated Julia with old-fashioned courtesy that reminded her of her grandfather. They were good men, all of them, and they treated Julia with respect. She knew they probably wondered about her story, about why a woman her age was working as a housekeeper on a ranch instead of raising a family of her own. But none of them asked questions she did not want to answer. Late one afternoon, as Julia was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, she heard the sound of horses approaching. She looked up to see a group of riders coming toward the ranch house, and her heart froze. In the lead was a figure she recognized all too well, even from a distance: Thomas. Her husband had found her. Julia dropped the sheet she was holding and ran toward the house. She burst through the back door, startling Mrs. Patterson, who was rolling out pie crust at the kitchen table. "What on earth?" the older woman exclaimed. "My husband is here," Julia said, her voice shaking. "Thomas is here." Mrs. Patterson's expression hardened. "Where is Bennett?" "I do not know. Out with the herd, I think." "Go to your room and stay there," Mrs. Patterson ordered. "I will handle this." But Julia shook her head. "He will not leave until he sees me. I know him." The sound of boots on the front porch made them both turn. A moment later, there was a heavy knock on the door. Mrs. Patterson wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it, Julia following close behind despite her fear. When Mrs. Patterson opened the door, Thomas stood there with two other men flanking him. He looked much as Julia remembered, tall and lean with dark hair and eyes that could turn cold in an instant. Those eyes found Julia immediately. "There you are," he said. "I have been looking for you." "What do you want, Thomas?" Julia asked, proud that her voice did not shake. "What do I want?" he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You are my wife. You belong with me." "You left me," Julia said. "You took everything we had and abandoned me in a strange town with no money and no way to survive." "I had some business to take care of," Thomas said dismissively. "I am back now. Get your things. We are leaving." "No," Julia said. The word came out stronger than she felt. Thomas's expression darkened. "No, you do not get to tell me no. You are my wife." "This is private property," Mrs. Patterson said sharply, and the lady said no. "Time for you to leave." Thomas ignored her, his eyes fixed on Julia. "I am not leaving without you." "Now stop being foolish and get your things." She said no. Bennett's voice came from behind Thomas, low and dangerous. Julia had not heard him approach, but there he was, standing at the bottom of the porch steps. Tommy and Pete flanked him, both men wearing serious expressions. Thomas turned to face Bennett. "This does not concern you." "It does when you come onto my property and harass one of my employees," Bennett said evenly. The lady said no. "That means it is time for you to leave." "She is my wife," Thomas repeated, his voice rising. "I have a legal right to her." "You lost any rights you had when you abandoned her," Bennett replied. "Now you have two choices. You can leave peacefully or we can help you leave. But either way, you are leaving." Thomas looked from Bennett to the other ranch hands who had started to gather, drawn by the commotion. He was outnumbered and he knew it. But Julia could see the rage building in him, the way his jaw clenched and his fists tightened. "You are going to regret this," Thomas said to Bennett. Then he looked at Julia. "And you are still my wife. This is not over." He turned and stalked back to his horse. His two companions followed, and the three of them rode off in a cloud of dust. Julia watched them go, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. When they were out of sight, her legs gave out. Bennett was there instantly, catching her before she could fall. He helped her to a chair on the porch, and Mrs. Patterson brought her a glass of water. "Drink," the older woman commanded. Julia's hands shook so badly she could barely hold the glass. Bennett knelt in front of her, his hand steadying hers. "He is gone," Bennett said gently. "You are safe." "He will come back," Julia whispered. "You do not know him like I do. He will not let this go." "Then we will be ready," Bennett said firmly. "He is not going to hurt you, Julia. I promise you that." Julia looked into Bennett's eyes and saw the truth of his words there. He meant it. He would protect her. The realization made something inside her chest crack open, releasing emotions she had been holding back for weeks. "I am so sorry," she said, tears starting to fall. "I have brought trouble to your door. This is not your problem." "Yes, it is," Bennett said. "You are under my protection now. That makes it my problem. And I do not let anyone threaten what is mine." "What is mine?" The words sent a shiver through Julia that had nothing to do with fear. She looked at Bennett, really looked at him, and saw something in his face that made her breath catch. It was more than kindness, more than simple protection. There was something deeper there, something that mirrored the feelings that had been growing in her own heart. "Thank you," she whispered. Bennett stood up but kept her hand in his. "Come inside. You are shaking." That night Bennett posted Tommy to keep watch. Julia protested that it was not necessary, but Bennett was firm. "I am not taking chances with your safety," he said. "Tommy will watch the house tonight. Tomorrow I will ride into Great Bend and have a talk with the sheriff." "The sheriff will not help," Julia said. "Thomas is my legal husband. The law is on his side." "Maybe," Bennett said, "but the sheriff should still know that there might be trouble. And I want it on record that he came here making threats." Julia nodded, too tired to argue. The encounter with Thomas had drained her of what little energy she had left after a long day of work. That night, Lying in her narrow bed, Julia could not sleep. Every sound made her jump, convinced that Thomas had returned. But the night passed quietly, and when dawn came, Julia rose and went about her work with grim determination. She would not let Thomas's threats derail the new life she was building. Bennett rode into Great Bend that morning as promised. When he returned that afternoon, his expression was troubled. "What did the sheriff say?" Julia asked. "Not much I wanted to hear," Bennett admitted. They were standing in the yard away from the house where Mrs. Patterson and the ranch hands might overhear. "He says that legally, Thomas has a right to expect his wife to return to him. He also says that unless Thomas actually harms you, there is not much the law can do." Julia felt her stomach drop. "So I am trapped. Either I go back to a man who abandoned me, or I wait for him to force me." "No," Bennett said firmly. "There is another option." "What option?" Bennett was quiet for a long moment, and Julia could see him wrestling with something. Finally, he said, "You could divorce him." "Divorce?" Julia shook her head. "Even if I could afford a lawyer, which I cannot, divorce is scandalous. I would be ruined." "Would you rather be ruined or dead?" Bennett asked bluntly. "Because that man has violence in his eyes, Julia. I saw it. If he gets you alone, I do not think it will end well." Julia knew he was right. She had seen that violence in Thomas before, had felt it in the bruises he left on her arms, the split lip from when he struck her. "Even if I wanted to divorce him, it could take months or years. What am I supposed to do in the meantime?" "Stay here," Bennett said. "Stay here where you are safe and let me worry about Thomas Owens." "I cannot ask you to do that," Julia protested. "This is not your fight." Bennett stepped closer to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool afternoon air. "What if I want it to be my fight?" he asked softly. Julia's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Bennett said, his eyes never leaving hers, "that somewhere in the past few weeks you have become important to me, Julia. More important than you should be. When I saw that man on my porch claiming rights to you, I wanted to knock him from here to Sunday. Not just because it was the right thing to do, but because the thought of you with him, the thought of you suffering, makes me see red." Julia's heart was racing. "Bennett, I am still married. Whatever this is between us, it cannot be." "I know," Bennett said. "And I am not asking for anything you cannot give, but I am telling you the truth of my feelings because you deserve to know. You deserve to know that you are valued, that you are seen, that you matter. Not because of a piece of paper that says you are someone's wife, but because of who you are as a person." Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks. "I do not deserve your kindness." "Yes, you do," Bennett said. He reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb, the gesture so tender it made Julia's heart ache. "You deserve every good thing, Julia Owens. And someday, when you are free of that man, I hope you will let me show you just how good things can be." Julia knew she should step back, should put distance between them, but she could not make herself move. Instead, she leaned into Bennett's touch, closing her eyes and letting herself feel, just for a moment, what it might be like to be cherished. "I wish I had met you first," she whispered. "So do I," Bennett replied. "But we cannot change the past. All we can do is decide what we want the future to look like." They stood there for a long moment, neither moving, neither speaking. Finally, Julia stepped back. "I should get back to work. Mrs. Patterson will wonder where I am." Bennett nodded, letting her go. But as Julia walked back to the house, she could feel his eyes on her, and she knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. They had acknowledged the feelings that had been growing, had named them and brought them into the light. There was no going back from that. The next few weeks passed in a state of tension. Thomas did not return, but Julia felt his presence like a shadow hanging over everything. She threw herself into her work, rising earlier and staying up later, as though exhaustion might quiet the turmoil in her heart and mind. Bennett gave her space, but she would often catch him watching her with an expression that made her feel warm and confused and hopeful all at once. The ranch hands had noticed the change in their boss, the way he found excuses to be near the house, the way his eyes followed Julia whenever she was in sight. Mrs. Patterson definitely noticed, but the older woman said nothing, just watched with knowing eyes. One evening in early October, as Julia was washing dishes after dinner, Bennett came into the kitchen. It had become his habit to help her clean up, despite Mrs. Patterson's continued protests that it was not fitting for the ranch owner to do servant's work. "I have been thinking," Bennett said as he dried a plate, "about your situation with Thomas." Julia's hand stilled in the dishwater. "What about it?" "I talked to a lawyer in Hutchinson last week," Bennett said. "He says you have grounds for divorce. Desertion is a legal reason in Kansas. Since Thomas left you without support, you could petition for divorce on those grounds." "I told you I cannot afford a lawyer," Julia said. "I can," Bennett replied. Julia turned to face him, her hands dripping soapy water onto the floor. "No, absolutely not. You have already done too much for me." "I want to do this," Bennett said. "Let me help you, Julia. Let me give you a way out." "Why?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for me?" Bennett set down the plate and the dish towel, then took Julia's wet hands in his. "Because I am in love with you," he said simply. "I know it is too soon. I know the situation is complicated, but it is the truth. I am in love with you, and I cannot stand by and watch you suffer when I have the means to help." Julia felt like all the air had left the room. "Bennett, you cannot say things like that." "Why not? It is how I feel." "Because I am married to another man," Julia said, pulling her hands away. "Because even if I was not, I am broken, Bennett. Thomas broke something in me. I do not know if I can be what you need." "You are not broken," Bennett said fiercely. "You are bruised and hurt, yes, but you are also strong and brave and kind. I see you, Julia. I see who you really are, and that woman is extraordinary." Julia wanted to believe him. More than anything, she wanted to believe that she could be loved, that she could be whole again. But fear held her back, fear that she would disappoint him, that she would fail him the way she had failed at her marriage. "I need time," she said finally. "I need time to think, to figure out what I want." "Take all the time you need," Bennett said. "I am not going anywhere." But time was the one thing Julia did not have. 3 days later, she was in the garden picking the last of the season's vegetables when she heard shouting from the front of the house. She dropped her basket and ran, her heart in her throat. Thomas was back, and this time he was not alone. He had brought at least a dozen men with him, all of them armed. They were facing off against Bennett and the ranch hands in the yard, and the tension was thick enough to cut. "I told you I would be back," Thomas called out when he saw Julia. "Now stop hiding behind these men and come with me." "I am not going anywhere with you," Julia said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, you are," Thomas said. He pulled out a piece of paper and waved it in the air. "I have a writ here from a judge in Missouri saying that you are my legal wife and you have to come home with me. Any man who tries to stop me is interfering with a lawful order." Bennett stepped forward. "That paper does not mean anything here. This is Kansas, and she has the right to refuse." "Actually, I do not think she does," a new voice said. Julia turned to see the sheriff from Great Bend riding up, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Sorry, Bennett, but he is right. The law says a man has authority over his wife. Unless she has grounds for divorce and has filed the papers, she has to go with him." "You cannot be serious," Bennett said, his voice dangerous. "I do not like it any more than you do," the sheriff said, "but it is the law. She is his wife." "I will divorce him," Julia said suddenly. All eyes turned to her. "I will file for divorce." Bennett has offered to help me. So I am not going anywhere with Thomas. Thomas laughed. Divorce takes time, darling, and until the divorce is final, you are still my wife, which means you are coming with me, now. He started toward her, and Bennett moved to block his path. Over my dead body, Bennett said. That can be arranged, Thomas replied, his hand dropping to his gun. Stop, Julia cried out. She could not let this turn violent. She could not be responsible for Bennett getting hurt or worse. Stop, please. She looked at Bennett, her heart breaking. I will go with him. No, Bennett said. Julia, no. I have to, Julia said. She walked toward Thomas, each step feeling like a march to her own execution. But before she reached him, Bennett grabbed her arm. Please do not do this, he said, his voice raw. Please, Julia. Julia looked up at him, memorizing his face, the warmth of his hand on her arm, the desperation in his eyes. I am sorry, she whispered. I am so sorry. She pulled away from him and walked to where Thomas waited. He grabbed her roughly by the arm and dragged her toward his horse. Let me get my things, Julia said. You do not need anything from here, Thomas said. He practically threw her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. You are mine now. The sooner you remember that, the better off you will be. As they rode away, Julia looked back at the ranch. Bennett stood in the yard, his hands clenched into fists, looking like a man who had just lost everything. Mrs. Patterson was on the porch, a hand pressed to her mouth. The ranch hands stood in a silent line, helpless witnesses to her departure. Julia turned forward, closing her eyes against the tears. She had known it was too good to be true, this brief glimpse of happiness. She had been foolish to hope for more. Thomas took her to a cabin about 20 miles from Great Bend. It was small and dirty and isolated. As soon as they were inside, he shoved her roughly toward the back room. You made a fool of me, he snarled, running off like that, shacking up with another man. I did not shack up with anyone, Julia said. I was working as a housekeeper, earning honest wages. Thomas struck her across the face. The blow knocked her to the floor and she tasted blood in her mouth. Do not lie to me, Thomas said. I saw the way that Cowboy looked at you. I saw the way you looked at him. You are my wife, and you will remember your place. He left her on the floor and went back to the main room. Julia heard him talking to his men, heard the clink of bottles and the sound of cards being shuffled. They were settling in for the night. Julia pulled herself up and sat on the filthy bed in the corner. Her cheek throbbed where Thomas had hit her. She knew this was just the beginning, knew that life with Thomas would only get worse from here. She had seen glimpses of his cruelty before, but now that he felt his authority had been challenged, he would make sure she never forgot who was in control. She thought about Bennett, about the ranch, about the life she had been building. She thought about Mrs. Patterson's kindness and the respect of the ranch hands and the simple joy of baking biscuits that people appreciated. She thought about Bennett's words, about how he saw her as strong and brave and kind. She thought about the way his eyes lit up when he smiled at her, the gentleness of his hands, the conviction in his voice when he promised to protect her. She thought about all of that, and she made a decision. She was not going to give up. She was not going to resign herself to a life of cruelty and fear. Bennett had told her she was strong and brave. It was time to prove him right. Julia waited until she heard Thomas and his men settling down for the night, the sounds of their voices growing quieter as they drank themselves into a stupor. She waited until the cabin grew silent except for snoring. Then she stood up and crept to the door of the small room. The main room was dark, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace. Thomas was asleep at the table, his head on his arms. 2 of his men were sprawled on the floor, and the others had gone outside to sleep in their bedrolls. Julia could see the outline of the front door, her escape route. She moved as quietly as she could, her heart pounding so loud she was sure someone would hear it. She was halfway across the room when a floorboard creaked under her foot. She froze, but no one stirred. She took another step, then another. She was almost to the door when a hand grabbed her ankle. Julia bit back a scream and looked down to see one of Thomas's men, a burly fellow with mean eyes, looking up at her. "Where do you think you are going?" he asked, his voice slurred with drink. "Let me go," Julia said, trying to pull her ankle free. "I do not think so," the man said. He started to raise his voice to call for Thomas, but Julia acted on instinct. She grabbed a poker from beside the fireplace and swung it hard, connecting with the side of his head. He slumped to the floor, unconscious. Julia did not wait to see if he was badly hurt. She dropped the poker and ran for the door, yanking it open and stumbling out into the night. She could hear shouting behind her as the commotion woke Thomas and the others, but she did not look back. She just ran. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind clouds. Julia ran blindly, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs pumping as fast as they could go. She could hear men shouting behind her, hear the sound of horses being saddled. They would come after her. She needed to find somewhere to hide. She ran into the darkness of the prairie, the tall grass whipping at her skirts. She had no idea where she was going, no plan beyond getting as far away from Thomas as possible. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out, and then she ran some more. She almost did not see the ravine until she was falling into it. She tumbled down the steep embankment, rocks and dirt tearing at her clothes and skin. She landed hard at the bottom, the wind knocked out of her. For a moment she just lay there, gasping for air, every part of her body screaming in pain. Above her, she could hear horses approaching. She could see the glow of torches moving across the prairie. They were searching for her. Julia pressed herself against the side of the ravine, making herself as small as possible, praying they would not think to look down here. The searchers passed overhead, their voices drifting down to her. "She could not have gone far on foot," one man said. "We will find her when the sun comes up," Thomas's voice replied. "Stupid woman will freeze out here in the dark anyway. Either way, she will learn her lesson." They moved on, and Julia waited until she could no longer hear them before she dared to move. Every part of her hurt, but she forced herself to stand. She could not stay here. As soon as dawn came, they would find her. She started walking along the ravine, using the sides as cover. She had no idea where she was or which direction to go, but she kept moving because stopping meant giving up, and she had promised herself she would not give up. The night seemed endless. Julia stumbled through the darkness, cold and hurting and scared. She thought about Bennett constantly, wondered if he was thinking about her, if he had any idea what had happened. She wished she could send him a message somehow, let him know she was trying to get back to him. As dawn started to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Julia saw something that made hope surge in her chest. In the distance, she could see a windmill and what looked like a small ranch. Where there were people, there might be help. She climbed out of the ravine and started walking toward the windmill. Every step was agony. Her body was battered from the fall and exhausted from the long night, but she pushed forward. She had come this far. She could not give up now. She was perhaps 100 yards from the ranch when she heard the sound of a horse behind her. She turned to see Thomas riding toward her, alone this time, his face twisted with rage. "Did you really think you could run from me?" he shouted. Julia started to run, but she was too tired, too hurt. Thomas caught up to her easily. He jumped down from his horse and grabbed her, spinning her around and hitting her so hard she saw stars. "You are going to regret this," he snarled, drawing back his hand to hit her again. The shot rang out across the morning air, clear and sharp. Thomas jerked, a look of surprise on his face. He looked down at his shoulder where blood was starting to bloom across his shirt. He looked up, and Julia followed his gaze to see Bennett riding toward them at a full gallop, a rifle in his hands. "Get away from her," Bennett shouted. Thomas stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. "You shot me," he said, sounding genuinely shocked. "That was a warning," Bennett said, pulling his horse to a stop and aiming the rifle at Thomas again. "The next one will not be." Julia could barely believe her eyes. "Bennett, how did you find me?" "We have been tracking you all night," Bennett said, never taking his eyes off Thomas. Behind him, Julia could see Tommy and Pete riding up, along with the sheriff from Great Bend. "When we saw you were gone from that cabin, we figured you had run. We have been searching ever since." The sheriff rode forward, his expression grim. "Thomas Owens, I am placing you under arrest for kidnapping and assault." "You cannot arrest me," Thomas protested. "She is my wife." "That does not give you the right to beat her or hold her against her will," the sheriff said. "I should have stood up to you yesterday. I am not making that mistake again." He pulled out a pair of handcuffs and secured Thomas's hands behind his back, eliciting a cry of pain from the wounded man. Bennett dismounted and ran to Julia. He gathered her into his arms and she collapsed against him, finally letting the tears come. "I have got you," he murmured into her hair. "You are safe now, I have got you." "I am so sorry," Julia sobbed. "I should not have gone with him." "You did what you thought you had to do to protect me," Bennett said. "But you do not have to protect me, Julia. That is my job, protecting you." He pulled back enough to look at her face, and his expression darkened when he saw the bruises forming where Thomas had hit her. "He hurt you." "I will heal," Julia said. "I just want to go home." "Then let us go home," Bennett said. He helped her onto his horse, then climbed up behind her. As they rode away from that terrible place, Julia leaned back against Bennett's chest and finally let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she really was safe now. They rode back to the Cole ranch, and Mrs. Patterson fussed over Julia like a mother hen, cleaning her wounds and putting her to bed with strict orders to rest. The doctor was called and examined Julia, declaring that while she was bruised and battered, nothing was seriously damaged. She would recover with time and rest. Over the next few days, as Julia healed, she learned what had happened after Thomas took her away. Bennett had wanted to come after her immediately, but the sheriff had held him back, insisting that they needed to follow the law. But when Bennett rode to the cabin where Thomas had taken Julia and found signs of a struggle, found blood on the floor and Julia missing, the sheriff had finally agreed they needed to act. They had tracked Thomas and his men through the night, following the trail until they found the cabin empty and the search party scouring the prairie. They had waited until dawn, then split up to cover more ground. It was Bennett who found Julia just in time. Thomas was charged with assault and held in jail while he awaited trial. A lawyer came from Hutchinson to talk to Julia about filing for divorce. With Thomas's violent behavior now documented, the lawyer said she had an excellent case. It would still take time, but Julia's marriage would end, and she would be free. 2 weeks after that terrible night, Julia was back on her feet and working in the kitchen alongside Mrs. Patterson. Her body still ached, and the bruises were only just starting to fade, but she insisted on pulling her weight. Work helped her feel normal again, helped her push away the nightmares that sometimes woke her in the darkness. Bennett gave her space, seeming to understand that she needed time to process everything that had happened. But she would catch him watching her sometimes, his eyes full of concern and something deeper, something that made her heart race. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Julia found herself standing on the porch watching the last light of day. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Bennett approaching. Beautiful sunset, he said, coming to stand beside her. It is, Julia agreed. I never took the time to appreciate sunsets before. I was always too busy, too worried about tomorrow to enjoy today. And now, Bennett asked. Julia was quiet for a moment, thinking. Now I realize how precious each day is, how quickly things can change. How important it is to be grateful for the good moments when you have them. Bennett nodded. I have been thinking about that too, about how quickly things can change, how you can meet someone and suddenly your whole world looks different. Julia turned to face him. Bennett, about what you said before, about your feelings for me, I need you to know something. You do not have to explain, Bennett said quickly. I understand if things are too complicated, if you need time. Let me finish, Julia said gently. She took a deep breath. When you said you loved me, I was too scared to believe it. I was too broken to think I could ever deserve that kind of feeling from someone. But these past few weeks, lying in bed recovering, I have had a lot of time to think. And I realized something. I fell in love with you too. Bennett's breath caught. Julia. I fell in love with you the day you gave me my ring back and asked for nothing in return, Julia continued, the words spilling out now that she had started. I fell more in love with you every time you were kind to me, every time you made me feel valued and seen. When Thomas took me away, the thing that hurt most was not what he did to me. It was the thought that I might never see you again, that I would never get the chance to tell you how I feel. How do you feel? Bennett asked, his voice rough with emotion. I feel like I've been lost in the dark for years, and you are the light that finally showed me the way home, Julia said. I feel like every hard thing I went through was worth it because it led me to you. I feel like maybe I can be whole again if you are patient with me. Bennett reached out and cupped her face gently in his hands, careful of the fading bruises. I will be patient. I will be whatever you need me to be. Just be yourself, Julia said. That is all I need. Bennett leaned down and kissed her softly, sweetly, a kiss full of promise and hope and the beginning of something beautiful. Julia kissed him back, feeling something inside her chest that had been closed off for so long finally open up. This was what love was supposed to feel like. Not fear and pain and walking on eggshells, but safety and warmth and being cherished. When they finally pulled apart, Bennett rested his forehead against hers. I am going to marry you, he said. As soon as you are free, I am going to marry you properly and spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it. I could never regret you, Julia said. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. The divorce took 4 months to finalize. During that time, Julia and Bennett courted properly, though they lived under the same roof. Bennett was scrupulous about maintaining propriety, never being alone with Julia for too long, never doing anything that might damage her reputation further. But they talked for hours, learning everything about each other. They went for chaperoned rides across the ranch, Bennett showing her every corner of the land he loved. They sat together in the evenings while Henry played guitar, Bennett's hand finding Julia's in the space between their chairs. Thomas was sentenced to 2 years in prison for assault. The judge made it clear that while the law gave husbands certain rights over their wives, it did not give them the right to brutalize those wives. It was a small victory, but an important one. On a bright day in March of 1879, Julia's divorce was finalized. She was free. That same day, Bennett proposed to her officially, getting down on one knee in front of Mrs. Patterson and all the ranch hands and pulling out a simple gold band. Julia Owens, you are the strongest, bravest, kindest woman I have ever known. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, Julia said, tears streaming down her face. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch. Mrs. Patterson cried through the whole thing. The ranch hands cleaned up and wore their Sunday best and grinned like fools. The new preacher from Great Bend performed the ceremony, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Bennett kissed Julia with such joy and love that Julia felt like her heart might burst. The reception was held in the yard, with tables of food that Julia and Mrs. Patterson had spent days preparing. There was dancing and music and laughter. Julia wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, and wildflowers in her hair that Bennett had picked that morning. She had never felt more beautiful, more loved, more perfectly happy. As the sun set on her wedding day, Julia found herself back on the porch where she and Bennett had first confessed their love. Bennett came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Julia said. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is real, that I get to spend my life with you." "Believe it," Bennett said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "This is real. We are real. And I am going to spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you know how loved you are." Julia turned in his arms and kissed him deeply. "Take me inside, husband," she said when they finally broke apart. "I am ready to start our life together." Bennett swept her up into his arms, making her laugh, and carried her into their home. Their real home, built on love and respect, and the kind of partnership Julia had always dreamed of, but never thought she would find. The years that followed were not always easy. Ranch life was hard work, and there were droughts and harsh winters and cattle that got sick. But through it all, Julia and Bennett faced every challenge together. They worked side by side, building their life and their future. Mrs. Patterson stayed on for 2 more years before retiring to live with her daughter in Wichita. She left the running of the house to Julia, who proved to be every bit as capable as the older woman had been. Julia became known throughout the county for her baking, her pies and biscuits legendary. She fed the ranch hands and welcomed travelers who needed a meal and a place to rest. She made the Cole Ranch not just a working ranch, but a home. In the winter of 1880, Julia gave birth to their first child, a healthy baby boy they named William after Bennett's father. Bennett cried when he held his son for the first time, overcome with the miracle of this new life they had created together. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Rose, after Bennett's mother. She had Julia's dark hair and Bennett's warm eyes, and she wrapped her father around her little finger from the moment she was born. In 1884, they had another son, James, who was quiet and thoughtful and grew up to love the land as much as his father did. Julia never forgot those dark days when she stood outside the general store, hungry and desperate, ready to trade her wedding ring for a loaf of bread. She never forgot the kindness of the cowboy who gave her both and asked nothing back. She kept that original wedding ring, the one from her first marriage, locked in a box in their bedroom. It was a reminder of where she had come from, of how far she had traveled, of the woman she had been and the woman she had become. Sometimes, when Bennett was out working on the ranch and Julia had a quiet moment, she would take out that ring and look at it. She would remember the desperation she felt, the fear, the sense that her life was over. And then she would look around at the home she and Bennett had built, at the children playing in the yard, at the life she was living, and she would be grateful for every hard step that had led her here. Bennett would sometimes catch her with the ring, and he would wrap his arms around her and kiss the top of her head. "Do not live in the past," he would say gently. "I am not," Julia would reply. "I am just remembering how lucky I am to have found my future." As the years passed, the Cole Ranch prospered. Bennett's reputation as a fair employer and skilled rancher spread, and young men came from across Kansas hoping for work. Julia made sure every person who worked for them was well fed and fairly treated. She became a surrogate mother to many of the younger hands, offering advice and comfort when they needed it. The children grew. William proved to have his father's way with horses and his mother's kind heart. Rose was spirited and clever, never content to stay inside when there was a whole world to explore. James was the scholar of the family, always reading, always curious about how things worked. In 1890, when Julia was 30 years old and Bennett was 34, they had one more child, another daughter they named Grace. She was a surprise, unexpected after they thought their family was complete, but she was loved no less for it. Grace was the baby of the family, doted on by her older siblings and adored by her parents. Julia and Bennett grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They weathered the hard times and celebrated the good times. They supported each other through the loss of friends and the joy of grandchildren. They built a legacy not just of land and cattle, but of love and family, and the kind of partnership that others aspired to. On their 20th anniversary, Bennett took Julia back to Great Bend. They walked down the main street hand in hand, and Bennett stopped outside Henderson's general store. It was under new ownership now, Henderson having died several years earlier, but the building was the same. "This is where I first saw you," Bennett said. "Standing at that counter, willing to trade away something precious because you had no other choice. And you gave me back my ring and bought me bread and asked for nothing in return," Julia said, remembering. "That was the day my life changed." "That was the day both our lives changed," Bennett corrected. He pulled her close and kissed her right there on the street, not caring who saw. "Best decision I ever made, helping that beautiful, desperate woman in the general store." "Best gift I ever received," Julia replied. "You gave me more than bread and a ring that day, Bennett. You gave me hope. You gave me a future. You gave me love." They walked back to their wagon where their youngest two children waited. As they drove back to the ranch, Julia looked out at the wide Kansas prairie and thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the woman she had been, broken and afraid, and the woman she had become, strong and confident and deeply loved. She reached over and took Bennett's hand, lacing her fingers through his. He glanced at her and smiled, that warm smile that still made her heart flutter after all these years. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," Bennett replied. "Always have, always will." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in the brilliant colors Julia had learned to appreciate, the Cole family headed home. To the ranch that had become a haven, to the life they had built together, to the love that had saved them both. Julia had traded her wedding ring for bread once, desperate and alone. A cowboy had given her both and asked nothing back. But what he had really given her was so much more. He had given her a reason to hope, a chance to heal, and a love that lasted a lifetime. And that, Julia thought as Bennett helped her down from the wagon, and their children ran laughing toward the house, was worth more than all the gold rings in the world. The Cole Ranch continued to thrive for generations. William took over the running of the ranch when Bennett's health began to fail in his later years, and he did so with the same integrity and fairness his father had shown. Rose married a schoolteacher and moved to Topeka, but visited often with her children. James became a veterinarian and set up practice in Great Bend, caring for the animals of the county. Grace, the baby, proved to have a talent for music and gave piano lessons to the children of the area. Bennett and Julia lived to see all their children grown and married, lived to hold grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. They grew old together on the ranch they loved, sitting on the porch in the evenings and watching the sunsets that never got old. When Bennett died in 1912 at the age of 56 after a long illness, Julia grieved deeply. But she also felt grateful for the 33 years they had shared, for every moment of love and laughter and partnership. She lived for another 8 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, and the day he gave a desperate woman her dignity back along with a loaf of bread. Julia passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1920, in the same bed she had shared with Bennett, in the same house where they had raised their children. She was buried next to Bennett on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the wide Kansas sky they had both loved. On her gravestone, her children had inscribed these words: Julia Owens Cole, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She knew the value of kindness. The story of how Bennett and Julia met became a family legend passed down through generations. It was told at family gatherings and written in journals, and used as an example of how one act of kindness can change everything. It reminded the Cole descendants that wealth was not measured in land or cattle or money, but in the love you gave and received, in the lives you touched, in the grace you showed to others. The old wedding ring, the one Julia had almost traded away, was kept by the family as an heirloom. It was passed to Rose, who passed it to her daughter, who passed it to her daughter. Each generation was told the story of their great-great-grandmother who was ready to trade her wedding ring for bread, and the cowboy who gave her both and asked nothing back. Each generation learned that sometimes the greatest treasures come not from what we own, but from the kindness of strangers who see our worth when we cannot see it ourselves. The Cole Ranch remained in the family for over a century, a testament to the foundation Bennett and Julia built. And though the world changed around it, though the Old West gave way to the modern age, the values that Bennett and Julia instilled in their family remained constant. Kindness, hard work, integrity, and love. Their love story was not the stuff of dramatic novels. There were no shootouts or Indian raids or gold strikes. It was simply the story of two people who found each other at the right moment, who chose each other every day, who built a life together one sunset at a time. But sometimes, the simple stories are the most powerful ones. Sometimes, the greatest love stories are not about grand gestures, but about quiet acts of kindness that bloom into something beautiful and lasting. Julia had been prepared to give up her past for survival. Instead, she found a man who gave her a future without asking for anything in return. And in doing so, he showed her what love really looked like. Not possession or control, but respect and partnership. Not taking, but giving. Not diminishing, but building up. In the end, that is what Julia and Bennett's story taught all who heard it, that love is not about what you can get from another person, but what you can give. That kindness is never wasted. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help when you need it. And that the greatest treasures in life are not things, but people, and the connections we build with them. Julia had traded her wedding ring for bread, desperate and alone. A cowboy had given her both and asked nothing back. But what he had really given her was a love that transcended time, a legacy that lasted generations, and proof that even in the hardest moments, hope can be found in the kindness of a stranger who sees your worth. And they lived, truly and deeply, happily ever after.